The sound of the washboard scraping against her raw knuckles had become as familiar to Maeve Brennan as her own heartbeat, a rhythm that had defined her existence for 23 long years. She plunged another shirt into the scalding water, ignoring the way her hands trembled from exhaustion, because stopping had never been an option in a life that had demanded everything from her since she was 5 years old. Tulsa, Oklahoma, in the summer of 1877 was a place where survival meant grit, and Maeve had learned that lesson before most children learned to read. The laundry business she ran out of the back of Mrs. Henderson's boarding house was her third job of the day. She had already spent 6 hours scrubbing floors at the general store and another 3 serving drinks at the saloon, though she never touched a drop of alcohol herself. Her mother had died when she was barely old enough to remember her face, leaving behind nothing but debts, and a father who had disappeared into a whiskey bottle so deep he might as well have drowned in it. The sun was setting over the dusty streets when Maeve finally hung the last shirt on the line, her shoulders screaming in protest. She was thin, too thin, with dark hair that she kept pinned back in a severe bun and gray eyes that had forgotten how to dream. Her dress, patched and repatched, hung on her frame like a reminder of all the meals she had skipped to pay the rent on her tiny room above the smithy. "You are still working," came a voice from behind her, deep and rough like stones grinding together. Maeve spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. The man standing in the shadows of the alley was massive, easily over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they blocked out what remained of the evening light. His hair fell past his shoulders in dark waves, and his face was weathered from years spent outdoors. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, a startling blue that seemed to see right through her carefully constructed walls. "I am always working," she said, straightening her spine despite the exhaustion that made her bones feel like lead. "Can I help you with something?" The man stepped forward, and Maeve could see the thickness of his arms, muscles built from a life of hard labor that made her own struggles seem almost insignificant. He wore buckskin and homespun, clothes that marked him as someone who lived outside the boundaries of town life. "Name is Callum Finch," he said, his voice gentler than she expected from someone so imposing. "I have been watching you for 3 days now." Alarm flared through Maeve, and she took a step back, her hand reaching for the knife she kept hidden in her apron pocket. "That is not something you should admit to a woman." Callum held up his hands, and she noticed how large they were, scarred and calloused. "I do not mean any harm. I came down from the mountains to trade furs, and I have seen you working from dawn until well past dark. You do not stop. You barely eat. You look like you are one strong wind away from collapsing." "My welfare is none of your concern," Maeve said sharply, though something in his words made her chest tighten. No one had noticed her in years. She was just part of the scenery of Tulsa, the girl who worked too hard and never smiled. "Maybe it should be," Callum said, and there was something in his tone that made Maeve pause. It was not pity. She had heard enough pity to recognize it. This was something else, something that felt almost like respect mixed with concern. "I do not need charity," she said, lifting her chin. "I manage just fine on my own." Callum was quiet for a moment, studying her with those unsettling blue eyes. "How long have you been working like this?" "Since I was 5 years old," Maeve said, and she hated the way her voice cracked slightly on the words. "My father owed money to half the town, and when he disappeared, those debts became mine. I have been paying them off ever since." The expression that crossed Callum's face was something fierce and angry, but Maeve sensed the anger was not directed at her. "You were a child. Children do not have the luxury of being children when their parents fail them," Maeve said, and she turned back to gather the empty laundry basket. "Now, if you will excuse me, I have another job to get to." "What if I told you it was time to rest now?" Callum said, and the words hung in the air between them like a promise. Maeve laughed, but it was a bitter sound. "Rest is for people who can afford it. I cannot." "What if you could?" Callum pressed, moving to block her path. He was so close now that she could smell the scent of pine and wood smoke that clung to him, wild and clean in a way that made her think of places she had never been. "What if someone paid off your debts and gave you a chance to stop running yourself into the ground?" "Why would you do that?" Maeve demanded, suspicion flooding through her. "You do not even know me. What do you want in return?" Callum was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with an emotion she could not quite identify. "I want you to come to the mountains with me. I want to show you what it is like to wake up without the weight of the world on your shoulders. I want to give you a chance to remember what it feels like to be young." "I am not young," Maeve said, though she was only 23. "I have not been young in a very long time." "Then let me help you find that part of yourself again," Callum said, and the sincerity in his voice made something crack in Maeve's chest. She wanted to say yes. God, she wanted to say yes so badly that it hurt. But years of disappointment and betrayal had taught her that nothing came for free, and trusting people only led to pain. "I need to think about it," she said finally, and Callum nodded. "I am staying at the boarding house on Main Street," he said. "Room 7. If you change your mind, you know where to find me." He walked away, leaving Maeve standing in the alley with her empty laundry basket and a strange feeling blooming in her chest that she was almost afraid to name. That night, Maeve lay in her narrow bed above the smithy and stared at the ceiling. The room was stifling hot, and she could hear the sounds of Tulsa settling down for the night through the thin walls. Somewhere a dog barked, a couple argued in heated whispers, a baby cried. She thought about Callum Finch and his impossible offer. She thought about the way he had looked at her, like she was something precious and worth saving. She thought about the mountains and what it might be like to wake up somewhere clean and quiet, without the constant pressure of debts and obligations crushing her into the ground. But most of all, she thought about the words he had said. It was time to rest now. When had anyone ever told her that? When had anyone ever seen how hard she worked, how much she sacrificed, how close she was to breaking? Sleep did not come easily, and when it did, Maeve dreamed of pine forests and clear streams and a pair of blue eyes that seemed to see straight into her soul. The next morning, Maeve went through her routine with mechanical precision. She scrubbed the floors at the general store, served drinks at the saloon, and picked up the laundry from Mrs. Henderson's boarding house. But all day, her mind kept returning to Callum and his offer. She told herself it was foolish to even consider it. She did not know him. He could be lying. He could be dangerous. He could want things from her that she was not willing to give. But a small voice in the back of her mind whispered that maybe, just maybe, he was telling the truth. It was late afternoon when Maeve found herself standing outside the boarding house on Main Street. Her hands were shaking, and she told herself it was from exhaustion, not nerves. She climbed the stairs to the second floor and found room 7. For a long moment, she just stood there, her knuckles hovering inches from the door. Then she knocked. Callum opened the door almost immediately, as if he had been waiting for her. He was even more imposing in the confined space of the hallway, all muscle and height and raw masculine presence. "I want to see the papers," Maeve said without preamble. "If you are serious about paying off my debts, I want to see proof that you have the means to do it." Something that looked like approval flickered across Callum's face. "Smart," he said, stepping back to let her into the room. The space was small and plainly furnished, but it was clean. Callum pulled a leather pouch from his pack and set it on the small table. When he opened it, Maeve's breath caught. Inside were more gold coins than she had ever seen in her life. "I have been trapping and trading in the mountains for 10 years, Callum explained. "I do not spend much because I do not need much. This is more than enough to clear your debts and then some." Maeve reached out with trembling fingers to touch one of the coins, as if to verify it was real. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" Callum was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was low and intense. "Because 3 days ago, I watched you stumble in the street from exhaustion, catch yourself, and keep walking. I watched you give half your lunch to a beggar child even though you looked like you needed it more. I watched you work until your hands bled, and I saw something in you that reminded me of myself before I escaped to the mountains." He moved closer, and Maeve could feel the heat radiating from his body. "I know what it is like to be trapped by circumstances beyond your control. I know what it is like to work yourself to the bone and still feel like it is never enough. And I know what it is like to finally find freedom." "What do you get out of this?" Maeve asked, because she still could not quite believe that someone would help her without expecting something in return. "Honestly," Callum said, and a small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, "I am tired of being alone. I have a good life in the mountains, but it is a solitary one. I am not asking you to marry me or even to stay forever. I am just asking you to come with me for a while. Let me show you a different way of living. If you hate it, I will bring you back and set you up with enough money to start fresh somewhere else." It was too good to be true. Maeve knew that. But she also knew that if she did not take this chance, she would spend the rest of her life wondering what might have been. "How do I know I can trust you?" she asked. Callum held her gaze steadily. "You do not. Trust is something that has to be earned. All I can do is give you my word that I will never hurt you, and I will never force you to do anything you do not want to do." Maeve took a deep breath. It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, about to jump into an unknown void. "All right," she said. "I will come with you." The relief that flooded Callum's face was so genuine that it made Maeve's chest ache. "You will not regret this," he said. "I promise you that." Over the next 3 days, Callum proved himself to be a man of his word. He went with Maeve to every person she owed money to, and paid off her debts in full. He helped her gather her meager belongings and arrange for her few responsibilities to be transferred to others. And through it all, he was patient and kind in a way that Maeve had not experienced in so long that she had almost forgotten what it felt like. The morning they left Tulsa, Maeve stood at the edge of town and looked back at the place that had been her prison for most of her life. She felt no sadness at leaving, only a strange sense of liberation that made her feel light and unsteady, like she might float away if she was not careful. "Ready?" Callum asked from where he sat astride a massive black horse. He had bought Maeve her own mount, a gentle mare with kind eyes, and spent hours teaching her the basics of riding. "Ready," Maeve said, and she meant it. They rode north out of Tulsa, leaving the dust and noise of civilization behind them. Callum set an easy pace, mindful of Maeve's inexperience on horseback. He talked as they rode, telling her about the mountains and the cabin he had built with his own hands, about the wildlife and the changing seasons and the brutal beauty of living so close to nature. Maeve found herself relaxing for the first time in years. The rhythm of the horse beneath her, the warmth of the sun on her face, the endless expanse of sky above her, all of it combined to create a sense of peace that she had never known existed. They camped that first night beside a small stream. Callum handled everything with practiced ease, setting up their bedrolls, starting a fire, and catching fish for their dinner. Maeve watched him work, fascinated by the economical way he moved, every action purposeful and efficient. "You do not have to do everything," she said when he handed her a plate of cooked fish. "I can help." "Tonight you rest," Callum said firmly. "There will be plenty of time for you to learn camp skills. Right now, I want you to sit and eat and not think about anything that needs to be done." It was harder than Maeve expected. She kept wanting to jump up and clean something or organize something or do something productive. But Callum gently pushed her back down every time until finally she gave up and just sat, staring into the fire. "This feels wrong," she admitted quietly. "I do not know how to just sit still." "I know," Callum said, and there was understanding in his voice. "It will take time. Your body and your mind have been trained to believe that rest is wrong, that you only have value if you are working. But that is not true. You have value just by existing, Maeve. You do not have to earn your place in this world." Tears pricked at Maeve's eyes, and she blinked them back furiously. She was not a crier. She had learned long ago that tears were useless and weak, but Callum saw them anyway. He moved to sit beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body but not touching. "It is all right to cry," he said gently. "You have been holding it together for so long. You do not have to be strong every second of every day." "If I start crying, I might never stop," Maeve whispered. "Then cry," Callum said. "I will be here when you are done." And somehow that simple statement of solidarity was enough to break through the last of Maeve's defenses. She cried like she had not cried since she was 5 years old and realized her mother was never coming back. She cried for all the years of exhaustion and loneliness and fear. She cried for the childhood she had lost and the dreams she had buried so deep she had forgotten they existed. Through it all, Callum sat beside her, solid and steady as a mountain. He did not try to shush her or tell her it would be all right. He just sat with her in her grief, bearing witness to her pain without trying to fix it. When Maeve finally ran out of tears, she felt wrung out and empty, but also lighter somehow, as if she had put down a burden she had been carrying for so long that she had forgotten it was there. "Thank you," she said, her voice hoarse. "You do not have to thank me," Callum said. "This is what people do for each other when they care." The word care hung between them, and Maeve realized with a start that she was beginning to care about this strange mountain man who had appeared in her life, like an answer to a prayer she had never spoken. They traveled for 5 more days, moving steadily north into wilder country. The landscape changed around them, the flat prairies of Oklahoma giving way to rolling hills covered in thick forests. The air grew cooler and cleaner, and Maeve found herself breathing deeper, as if her lungs were expanding to take in this new world. Callum was an easy traveling companion. He was patient with Maeve's inexperience and never made her feel foolish for asking questions. He taught her how to read the weather, how to find water, how to move quietly through the forest so as not to startle the wildlife. And slowly, Maeve began to relax into this new life, her body remembering what it felt like to not be constantly on the verge of collapse. She also became increasingly aware of Callum himself, the way his muscles flexed when he swung an axe to cut firewood, the way his hair fell across his face when he bent to tend the fire, the way his hands, so large and rough, could be surprisingly gentle when he helped her down from her horse or handed her a cup of coffee. Maeve had never had time for romance. The few men who had expressed interest in her had been more interested in what she could do for them than who she was as a person. But Callum was different. He seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts and opinions. He listened when she talked and remembered small details she mentioned. And he never pushed her for anything more than she was willing to give. On the 6th day of their journey, they reached Callum's cabin. It sat in a clearing surrounded by towering pines, with a stream running clear and cold just a few yards from the front door. The cabin itself was larger than Maeve had expected, built from sturdy logs and chinked tight against the weather. There was a covered porch across the front and a stone chimney rising from one end. "This is beautiful," Maeve breathed, sliding down from her horse. Pride flickered across Callum's face. "I built it myself over 2 winters. It is not fancy, but it is solid and warm." Inside, the cabin was a single large room with a sleeping loft built into one end. There was a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, shelves lined with supplies, and a bed frame that looked like it had been built for someone Callum's size. Everything was clean and orderly, which somehow did not surprise Maeve. Callum struck her as the kind of man who took care of what was his. "You will take the bed," Callum said, setting down his pack. "I will sleep in the loft." "I cannot take your bed," Maeve protested. "Yes, you can," Callum said firmly. "You are my guest, and I will not have you sleeping on the floor or climbing a ladder when you are still exhausted." Maeve wanted to argue, but she was too tired and too overwhelmed by the changes in her life to put up much of a fight. Instead, she explored the cabin while Callum went to check his trap lines and make sure everything was in order. When he returned a few hours later, Maeve had cleaned the entire cabin, reorganized his supplies, and started a stew using provisions she found in his stores. Callum stood in the doorway, staring at the transformed space with an unreadable expression on his face. "I am sorry," Maeve said quickly. "I know you said I should rest, but I could not just sit still, and I wanted to do something to repay you for your kindness." "Maeve," Callum said, and there was something in his voice that made her stop. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and took her by the shoulders, gentle but firm. "You do not owe me anything. I did not bring you here to be my housekeeper or my servant. I brought you here to rest and to heal." "But I need to contribute," Maeve said desperately. "I need to be useful." "You are useful just by being here," Callum said, and the intensity in his blue eyes made her heart skip a beat. "You are valuable just as you are, not because of what you can do for me. Do you understand?" Maeve shook her head because she did not understand. She had never understood how to be a person without also being a worker. Callum sighed and released her shoulders. "All right. I can see this is going to take more than words, so here is what we are going to do. For the next week, you are going to do nothing. You are going to eat 3 meals a day. You are going to sleep as much as you need. You are going to sit on the porch and watch the birds and do absolutely nothing productive." "That sounds like torture," Maeve said honestly. "I know," Callum said, and there was sympathy in his voice. "But trust me, you need this." The first few days were indeed torture. Maeve felt restless and anxious, her body and mind screaming at her to do something, anything, to justify her existence. But Callum was implacable. Every time she tried to clean or cook or organize, he gently but firmly redirected her back to resting. "You have been working since you were 5 years old," he told her one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "Your body and soul are exhausted in ways you cannot even recognize because you have never known anything different. I am asking you to trust me and let yourself heal." Slowly, painfully, Maeve began to understand what he meant. As the days passed and her body started to recover from years of chronic exhaustion, she noticed things she had never noticed before. The way the morning light filtered through the trees, the sound of the stream bubbling over rocks, the feeling of genuine hunger, not the gnawing desperation of someone who had skipped too many meals, but the pleasant anticipation of food to come. She also noticed Callum. Really noticed him, not just as her rescuer or benefactor, but as a man. She watched him move through his daily routines with easy competence, chopping wood, checking traps, tending to the horses. She noticed the way he hummed tunelessly under his breath when he was content, the way he always made sure she had the best portions of food, the way he looked at her when he thought she was not paying attention, with an expression that made her stomach flutter. One morning, Maeve woke to find herself actually looking forward to the day ahead. It was such a foreign feeling that it took her a moment to identify it. For the first time in 18 years, she was not dreading the endless grind of work and obligation. Instead, she was curious about what the day might bring. She found Callum outside, splitting wood with powerful swings of his axe. His shirt was off despite the cool morning air, and Maeve could not help but stare at the play of muscles across his back and shoulders. He was built like a man who had spent his life doing hard physical labor, all thick muscle and raw strength. As if sensing her gaze, Callum turned and caught her watching. A slow smile spread across his face, and Maeve felt her cheeks heat with embarrassment at being caught. "Good morning," he said, setting down the axe and reaching for his shirt. "Good morning," Maeve replied, trying to sound casual. "I slept well." "I can tell," Callum said, and there was satisfaction in his voice. "You look better, more rested." It was true. Maeve had caught sight of herself in the small mirror Callum kept by his washing basin, and she had been startled by the change. The dark circles under her eyes had faded. Her skin had more color. She looked younger, softer, more like the girl she might have been if life had been kinder. "Thank you," she said softly, "for forcing me to rest. I did not realize how much I needed it." "You are welcome," Callum said, pulling his shirt on. "Are you ready to start learning some mountain skills? Or do you need more time?" "I am ready," Maeve said, and she meant it. The restlessness she had felt before was different now. It was not the desperate need to prove her worth, but genuine curiosity and a desire to learn. Over the following weeks, Callum taught Maeve everything he knew about surviving and thriving in the mountains. She learned how to set snares and check trap lines, how to tan hides and prepare meat for smoking, how to identify edible plants and which ones to avoid, how to read animal tracks and predict the weather by watching the sky. It was hard work, but it was different from the soul-crushing labor she had done in Tulsa. This work had purpose and meaning. She was learning skills that would keep her alive, not just earning money to pay off debts that should never have been hers in the first place. And through it all, Maeve became increasingly aware of her growing feelings for Callum. He was unlike any man she had ever known. He was strong but gentle, capable but patient, confident but never arrogant. He treated her like an equal partner, not a burden or a servant. And the way he looked at her sometimes, with a heat and longing that he tried to hide, made her heart race. One evening in late August, they were sitting by the stream after a long day of preparing winter stores. The air was cooling rapidly as the sun set behind the mountains, and Maeve found herself shivering despite her shawl. Without a word, Callum moved to sit behind her, wrapping his arms around her and pulling her back against his chest. Maeve tensed for a moment, then relaxed into his warmth. He was like a furnace, all heat and solid muscle, and she felt safe in a way she had never felt before. "Is this all right?" Callum asked, his breath warm against her ear. "Yes," Maeve whispered, because it was more than all right. It felt right in a way that made her chest ache with an emotion she was almost afraid to name. They sat like that for a long time, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. Maeve could feel the steady beat of Callum's heart against her back, and she found herself matching her breathing to his as if they were becoming synchronized. "Maeve," Callum said finally, his voice rough, "I need to tell you something." "What is it?" Maeve asked, twisting slightly to look up at his face. Callum was quiet for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts. "When I first saw you in Tulsa, I told myself I was helping you because it was the right thing to do, because I hated seeing someone so young working themselves to death. But that was not the whole truth. What was the whole truth? Maeve asked, her heart beating faster. The truth is that I took one look at you and felt something I have never felt before, Callum said, tightening his arms around her. I have been alone in these mountains for a long time, and I told myself I was content with that. But then I saw you, so fierce and determined and beautiful despite everything life had thrown at you, and I knew I did not want to be alone anymore. Maeve turned in his arms so she could face him properly. You think I am beautiful. I think you are the most beautiful thing I have ever seen, Callum said, and the sincerity in his voice made tears prick at her eyes, inside and out. And I know I said I did not expect anything from you, that you could leave whenever you wanted, but I need you to know that I am hoping you will stay. Not because you owe me or because you feel obligated, but because you want to. I do want to stay, Maeve said, reaching up to touch his face. His beard was rough under her fingers, and she felt him lean into her touch like he was starving for it. I have been falling in love with you, Callum Finch, and it terrifies me because I have never let myself love anything before. The expression that crossed Callum's face was pure joy. You do not have to be terrified, he said, covering her hand with his own. I will never hurt you, Maeve. I will spend the rest of my life making sure you feel safe and loved and valued. Promise, Maeve whispered. Promise, Callum said, and then he leaned down and kissed her. It was Maeve's first kiss, and it was everything she had never known to dream about. Callum's lips were soft despite the roughness of his beard, and he kissed her like she was something precious and fragile, even though she had proven she was anything but. His hand came up to cup her face, his thumb stroking gently across her cheekbone, and Maeve felt herself melting into him. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Callum rested his forehead against hers. I love you, he said. I know it is fast, and maybe I should wait to say it, but I do. I love you, Maeve Brennan. I love you too, Maeve said, and saying the words out loud felt like stepping off a cliff and discovering she could fly. They spent the rest of the evening by the stream, talking and kissing and making plans for the future. Callum asked Maeve if she would marry him, and when she said yes, he picked her up and spun her around, laughing with pure happiness. They were married a month later by a traveling preacher who came through the area. It was a simple ceremony with no guests beyond the preacher and the mountains themselves, but Maeve did not care. She wore a dress that Callum had bought her during their last trip into the nearest town, a beautiful blue that matched his eyes, and Callum wore his best buckskin with his hair pulled back. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Callum kissed Maeve like he was sealing a vow that went beyond words. And Maeve, who had never believed in happiness or hope or love, felt her heart expand with all three. Their wedding night was tender and sweet. Callum was patient with Maeve's inexperience, taking his time to show her the pleasures of the marriage bed. He worshipped her body like it was a temple, touching and kissing every inch of her skin until she was trembling and gasping his name. And when they finally came together, it felt like the final piece of a puzzle clicking into place. Two people who had been searching for each other without knowing it finally becoming whole. Afterward, Maeve lay in Callum's arms, tracing the scars on his chest with gentle fingers. Tell me about these, she said. Callum was quiet for a moment, then began to speak. He told her about his own difficult childhood, about a father who had been cruel and a mother who had died too young. He told her about running away at 15 and living rough in the mountains, learning to survive through trial and error. He told her about the bears and wolves and harsh winters that had marked his skin but not broken his spirit. I understand why you saw yourself in me, Maeve said when he was done. We both survived things that should have destroyed us. And we both found our way to each other, Callum said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. That is what matters now. The first winter in the mountains was harsh but beautiful. Snow fell deep and thick, covering the world in pristine white. Maeve, who had never experienced a proper winter, was enchanted by it all. She loved the way the trees looked coated in ice, the way the stream froze into fantastic shapes, the way the world seemed hushed and magical. Callum taught her to snowshoe and ice fish. They spent long evenings by the fire, Callum carving or repairing equipment while Maeve learned to sew and mend their clothes. They talked for hours, sharing stories and dreams and fears. They made love in front of the fire, their bodies warming each other against the cold. It was during a particularly fierce blizzard in January that Maeve realized she might be pregnant. She had missed her monthly courses and her breasts were tender. At first, she was terrified. She had never thought about being a mother, had never imagined having children of her own. But when she told Callum, his reaction banished her fears. He was overjoyed, lifting her up and spinning her around despite her protests that he might hurt the baby. "We are going to have a child," he kept saying, wonder in his voice. "Our child." "Are you not worried?" Maeve asked. "We are so far from any town. What if something goes wrong? Then we will deal with it," Callum said firmly. "Together. But nothing is going to go wrong, Maeve. You are strong and I will take care of you." Callum proved himself true to his word over the following months. He was attentive to Maeve's every need, making sure she ate well and rested often. He researched everything he could about pregnancy and childbirth, talking to the few women in the distant settlements, and reading every book he could get his hands on during their infrequent trips to town. As Maeve's belly grew, so did her confidence. She was not the frightened, overworked girl who had left Tulsa anymore. She was a woman who had learned to survive in the wilderness, who had found love and purpose, who was about to become a mother. Their son was born on a warm day in early September, with the autumn colors just beginning to show in the leaves. The labor was long and difficult, but Callum stayed by Maeve's side the entire time, holding her hand and whispering encouragement. When the baby finally emerged, red-faced and screaming, Callum cut the cord with shaking hands and placed the infant on Maeve's chest. Maeve looked down at her son, at his tiny perfect features and his shock of dark hair, and felt love so overwhelming it nearly knocked the breath from her lungs. "What should we name him?" she asked Callum, who was staring at them both with tears streaming down his face. "Thomas," Callum said. "After my mother's father, he was the only person in my family who was ever kind to me." "Thomas Finch," Maeve said, testing the name. "It is perfect." Thomas was a healthy, vigorous baby who seemed to have inherited his father's size and his mother's determination. He was demanding and loud, but also sweet and curious, and both Maeve and Callum were utterly besotted with him. Watching Callum with their son made Maeve fall even more deeply in love with him. He was a natural father, patient and gentle, but also playful and protective. He carved toys for Thomas and sang to him in a surprisingly tuneful voice and wore the baby in a sling while he worked, so Thomas could be close to him. As Thomas grew from infant to toddler, Maeve marveled at the life they had built. The cabin that had once seemed so spacious now felt cozy and full, filled with the sounds of Thomas's laughter and the evidence of family life. There were toys scattered on the floor and clothes drying by the fire, and a high chair that Callum had built at the table. They added to their family 3 years later when Maeve gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah. She was smaller and quieter than Thomas had been, with her mother's gray eyes and her father's dark hair. Thomas was fascinated by his baby sister, constantly wanting to hold her and help take care of her. The years passed in a blur of happiness and hard work. Thomas and Sarah grew strong and healthy, learning to read and write from the books Callum bought on his trading trips. They learned to trap and fish and survive in the mountains, but they also learned to laugh and play and dream. Maeve sometimes thought about her life in Tulsa and marveled at how different things were now. She was no longer the exhausted, hopeless girl who had worked herself to the bone. She was a wife and mother, a woman who had found her place in the world and knew her own worth. One evening in late summer, when Thomas was 7 and Sarah was 4, Maeve sat on the porch watching her children play by the stream while Callum worked on repairing the roof. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red, and Maeve felt a contentment so deep it was almost painful. Callum climbed down from the roof and came to sit beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "About how different my life is now," Maeve said, leaning into him. "About how you saved me." "We saved each other," Callum corrected gently. "I was just as lost before I met you. I just did not realize it." "Do you ever regret it?" Maeve asked. "Taking on a broken girl with nothing to offer?" Callum turned to face her, his expression serious. "You were never broken, Maeve. You were bent and battered, but never broken. And you had everything to offer. You gave me a home and a family and a purpose beyond just surviving. You are the best thing that ever happened to me." Maeve kissed him, pouring all her love and gratitude into it. "I love you," she said when they finally broke apart. "More than I ever thought it was possible to love anyone." "I love you too," Callum said. "Always." As the years continued to pass, their family grew even more. Maeve gave birth to 2 more children, another son they named Daniel and a daughter they named Claire. The cabin expanded to accommodate their growing family, with Callum building additional rooms and a larger sleeping loft. Thomas grew into a young man who looked remarkably like his father, tall and broad-shouldered with the same striking blue eyes. He was kind and responsible, always helping with his younger siblings and showing a natural talent for woodworking. Sarah became a quiet but fierce girl who loved animals and had a gift for gentling even the wildest horses. Daniel was adventurous and curious, always exploring and getting into mischief. And Claire was the baby of the family, sweet and affectionate and adored by her older siblings. Maeve sometimes felt overwhelmed by the abundance of her life. She had gone from having nothing and no one to having everything that mattered. She had a husband who loved her deeply, children who filled her days with joy and laughter, and a home that felt safe and warm. She never forgot where she had come from, though. She made sure her children knew the value of hard work and the importance of kindness. She taught them that people's worth was not determined by what they could produce or how useful they were, but by the content of their character. And she told them her own story, so they would understand how precious their life was and how easily things could have been different when Thomas was 18 and began talking about finding his own way in the world. Maeve felt the bittersweet ache of watching her children grow up. But she also felt proud, because Thomas was a good man who would make his way with honor and integrity. "You raised him right," Callum told her one night after Thomas had announced his plans to start his own trapping business in a different part of the mountains. "All of them." "They are good people, Maeve." "We raised them right," Maeve corrected. "You are as much their parent as I am." "I know," Callum said, pulling her close, "but I think they got their best qualities from you, their kindness, their determination, their ability to see the good in people." "And they got their strength and courage from you," Maeve said. "Their sense of honor and their protective instincts." "Then they got the best of both of us," Callum said, and Maeve had to agree. As their children grew and began to make their own lives, Maeve and Callum found themselves with more time together. They took long walks through the mountains, rediscovering the places they had explored when they were first falling in love. They spent evenings by the fire, holding hands and talking about their memories and dreams for the future. Maeve was 38 years old when she realized that she had now spent more of her life being happy than being miserable. It was a strange revelation, and it made her cry with a mixture of relief and gratitude. "What is wrong?" Callum asked, finding her on the porch with tears streaming down her face. "Nothing is wrong," Maeve said, laughing through her tears. "Everything is right. I was just thinking about how lucky I am, how lucky we are." Callum sat beside her and pulled her into his arms, just as he had done so many times over the years. "I think about that every day," he admitted, "about how my life would have been if I had not gone to Tulsa that summer. If I had not seen you and decided to help, about how empty and meaningless everything would have been without you." "I would have died," Maeve said quietly. "If you had not come along when you did, I would have worked myself to death within a few years. I was already so close to breaking." "But I did come along," Callum said firmly, "and you did not die. You lived and you thrived and you became the most amazing woman I have ever known." "Because you told me it was time to rest," Maeve said. "Because you saw that I was drowning and you threw me a lifeline. Because you loved me when I did not know how to love myself. And you gave me a reason to come down from the mountains," Callum said. "You gave me a family and a home and a life worth living. We saved each other, Maeve. That is what love does." On their 20th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a celebration. Thomas came back from his own cabin with his wife and infant daughter. Sarah brought her husband and their 2 sons. Daniel, now 15, and Claire, now 12, helped prepare a feast. They gathered in the clearing in front of the cabin, surrounded by the mountains that had become their home, and celebrated 2 decades of love and family. As Maeve looked around at her children and grandchildren, at the life she and Callum had built together, she felt a sense of completeness that she had never imagined possible. She thought about the 5-year-old girl who had started working to pay off her father's debts. She thought about the 23-year-old woman who had been so exhausted she could barely stand. And she thought about the mountain man who had looked at her and seen not a burden or a servant, but a person worth saving. "Thank you," she whispered to Callum as they danced together under the stars, their children and grandchildren watching with smiles. "For what?" Callum asked, though his eyes said he knew. "For everything," Maeve said. "For seeing me when I was invisible, for teaching me to rest, for loving me, for giving me this beautiful life." "Thank you for saying yes," Callum replied. "For trusting me enough to take a chance, for loving me back, for making me happier than I ever dreamed possible." They kissed and their children cheered, and Maeve felt like the luckiest woman in the world. The years continued to pass, bringing both joys and sorrows. They lost friends and neighbors to illness and accidents. They weathered harsh winters and difficult summers. But through it all, Maeve and Callum had each other, and that was enough. When Maeve was 45, she and Callum became grandparents for the 4th time. Thomas and his wife had another daughter, and they named her Maeve after her grandmother. Maeve cried when she held her tiny namesake, thinking about the circle of life and how far she had come. "Your grandmother was the bravest person I ever knew," Callum told little Maeve, even though she was too young to understand. "She survived things that would have broken most people, and she came out the other side stronger and kinder. I hope you grow up to be just like her." "I hope she grows up to be happy," Maeve said, stroking the baby's soft hair. "I hope she never has to work herself to exhaustion or feel like her worth is tied to her productivity. I hope she gets to be a child for as long as possible." "She will," Callum promised. "Because she has a family who loves her and will protect her. Because we broke the cycle, Maeve. We built something better." As Maeve moved into her 50s, she began to slow down a bit. The years of hard work in her youth had taken a toll on her body, and she had aches and pains that reminded her of where she had come from. But she did not mind. Every gray hair and every wrinkle was earned, proof that she had survived and thrived. Callum's hair was now more silver than dark, and his face was deeply lined from years spent outdoors. But to Maeve, he was still the most handsome man she had ever seen. And the way he looked at her, with love and desire and deep respect, never changed. They celebrated their 30th anniversary surrounded by their growing family. Thomas now had 4 children. Sarah had 3. Daniel had recently married and was expecting his first child. And Claire, now 22, was being courted by a young man from a neighboring settlement. "We built something good," Callum said to Maeve as they watched their family laughing and playing together. "We took our pain and our struggles and we transformed them into something beautiful." "We did," Maeve agreed, leaning into his solid warmth. "And I would do it all again, every hard moment and every struggle if it meant ending up here with you." "I love you, Maeve Finch," Callum said. "More today than yesterday and less than tomorrow." "I love you too," Maeve said. "Thank you for telling me it was time to rest. Thank you for saving my life." "Thank you for letting me," Callum said, and he kissed her as the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant colors. As they moved into their 60s, Maeve and Callum began to prepare for the next phase of their lives. They talked about what would happen to the cabin and the land when they were gone, about how to divide things fairly among their children. They wrote down their stories so their grandchildren would know where they came from and what they had overcome. But mostly, they just enjoyed each other. They took walks when the weather was good. They sat by the fire when it was cold. They held hands and talked and remembered and made new memories to add to the collection they had been building for over 30 years. When Maeve was 62, she woke one morning with a strange sense of peace. She looked at Callum, still sleeping beside her despite the early hour, and felt a rush of love so powerful it took her breath away. She thought about the girl she had been, working herself to death in Tulsa. She thought about the moment when Callum had stepped out of the shadows and offered her a chance at a different life. She thought about every moment since, all the laughter and tears and struggles and triumphs. She had been working since she was 5 years old, carrying burdens that should never have been hers. But then a mountain man had told her it was time to rest, and everything had changed. Maeve reached out and touched Callum's face, tracing the lines she had memorized over decades. He woke slowly, his blue eyes finding hers immediately. "Good morning," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "Good morning," Maeve replied. "I was just thinking about how grateful I am, for you, for our life, for every single day we have had together." "Me too," Callum said, covering her hand with his own. "Every single day." They rose together and went about their morning routine, comfortable in the rhythm they had established over so many years. They had breakfast on the porch, watching the sun rise over the mountains. They tended to the small garden Maeve still kept, even though they did not need to grow as much food anymore with their children bringing them supplies. In the afternoon, their grandchildren came to visit, a laughing, boisterous group that filled the cabin with noise and energy. Maeve and Callum told stories about the old days, about how they had met and fallen in love, about the struggles and triumphs of building a life in the mountains. "You two are my favorite love story," their granddaughter Maeve said, now a young woman of 17. "The way grandfather saved grandmother and then they built this whole family together. It is like something from a fairy tale." "It was not always easy," Maeve told her. "Love is work, just like anything else worth having. But it is the best kind of work, because you are building something with someone you care about. The key is to find someone who sees you for who you really are," Callum added. Someone who values you not for what you can do for them, but for who you are as a person. That is what your grandmother gave me and what I hope I gave her." "You did," Maeve said softly, reaching for his hand. "You absolutely did." As the sun set on another day, Maeve and Callum sat on their porch, watching their grandchildren play in the clearing. They were older now and slower, but the love between them was as strong as ever. "You ever regret it?" Maeve asked, the same question she had asked so many times over the years. "Taking a chance on a girl who had nothing to give you?" "Never," Callum said firmly. "Not for a single moment. You gave me everything that mattered. You still do." "I love you," Maeve said. "Thank you for teaching me how to rest. Thank you for showing me that I had value beyond my ability to work. Thank you for loving me." "Thank you for trusting me," Callum replied. "Thank you for taking a chance on a lonely mountain man who did not know how empty his life was until you filled it. Thank you for 40 years of happiness." They sat together as the stars began to emerge, content in the knowledge that they had lived a good life and loved each other well. From a girl who had been working since she was 5 years old to a woman who had learned to rest and thrive, Maeve's journey had been long and difficult. But it had led her exactly where she needed to be, in the arms of a man who had seen her worth when she could not see it herself. And as the mountains stood eternal around them, witnessing their love story, Maeve knew that she would not change a single thing. Every hardship had led her here, to this porch, to this man, to this beautiful life they had built together. She had been working since she was 5 years old, but a mountain man had told her it was time to rest, and in resting, she had found everything she had never known to dream about. Their story was not over, not quite yet. There were still mornings to wake up together, still sunsets to watch, still moments of joy and connection to share. But Maeve knew that when the end did come, she would face it without fear, because she had lived a life full of love and meaning and purpose. She had been saved by a mountain man who had seen her struggling and decided to help. But in saving her, he had also saved himself, and together they had created something beautiful and lasting that would continue in their children and grandchildren for generations to come. As Callum pulled her closer and pressed a kiss to her temple, Maeve smiled and closed her eyes, grateful for every moment, every memory, every breath they had shared. She had worked since she was 5 years old, but she had also loved and been loved, and that made all the difference. The end.